Hey everybody, this is the first video of chapter 2 of part 3 of Adorno's Negative Dialectics. Part 3 is titled Models. Chapter 2 of part 3 is titled World Spirit and Natural History, an Excursion to Hegel. All right. I'm going to read the table of contents for this chapter. Trend and fact, construction of the world spirit, quote, harmonizing with the world spirit, end quote, the unleashing of productive forces, group spirit and dominion, the legal sphere, law and equity, individualistic veil, dynamics of universal and particular, spirit as a social totality, historical reason antagonistic, universal history, antagonism contingent, question mark, the supramundane character of the Hegelian world spirit, Hegel siding with the universal, relapse into Platonism, detemporalization of time, dialectics cut short by Hegel, the role of the popular spirit obsolete, individual in history, the spell, regression under the spell, subject and individual, dialectics and psychology, quote, natural history, history and metaphysics. Okay, so here we go. Let's see, what page does this start on? Okay, so here we go. Chapter 2, World Spirit and Natural History, an Excursion to Hegel. And it starts with a section titled Trend and Facts. Most sensitively resisted by human, quote, common sense, end quote, by the sound wind whose soundness is what ails it, is the preponderance of anything objective over the individuals in their consciousness as well as in their coexistence. The preponderance can be experienced crassly day after day. One represses it as an unfounded speculation, so the individual may continue to flatter themselves that their standardized notions are twice unconditional truths, so their delusions may be preserved from the suspicion of not being so, and of their lives being doomed. Ours is an epoch that has been as relieved to shed the system of objective idealism as to discard the economic doctrine of objective values. And the theorems that are particularly topical in such an epoch are the ones said to be of no use to a spirit that seeks its own security and the security of cognition in the extant, in social institutions as the well-organized sums of immediate individual facts, or in the subjective character of their members. The objective and ultimately absolute Hegelian spirit, the Marxist law of value that comes into force without men being conscious of it, to an unleashed experience, these are more evident than the prepared facts of a positivistic scientific bustle, which today extends to the native pre-scientific consciousness, only to the greater glory of objective cognition. That activity breaks men of the habit of experiencing the real objectivity to which they are subjected in themselves as well. If thinking people were capable of such experience and prepared for it, it would have to undermine their belief in facticity itself. It would have to make them go so far beyond the facts that the facts would lose their unreflected primacy over the universals, which triumphant nominalism holds for nothing, for a subtractable adjunct tacked on by the classifying scientist. There is a line in the initial deliberations of Hegel's logic to the effect that nothing in the world is not as mediated as it is immediate. And nowhere does this line endure more precisely than in the facts of which historiography is so proud. Of course, when the Gestapo knocks on a dissenter's door at 6 a.m. under Hitlerite fascism, it would be foolish to use epistemological refinements to deny that the individual to whom this happens is more directly affected than by the preceding power plays and by the installation of the party machine in every branch of administration, let alone by the historical trend that shattered the continuity of the Weimar Republic and does not show in any context other than in a conceptual one, and not compulsorily except in theoretical unfoldment. And yet the brute fact of the governmental onslaught which fascism loses on the individual does depend on all those moments, however remote and currently irrelevant they may be to the victim. It would take the most wretched nitpicking garbed as scientific acribia to blind us to the fact that the French Revolution, for all the abrupt concurrence of some of its acts, fitted into the overall course of bourgeois emancipation. That revolution would have been neither possible nor successful if in 1789 the key positions of economic production had not been already occupied by the bourgeoisie, if it had not already topped the absolutist crest of a feudalism that coalesced at times with the bourgeois interest. Nietzsche's scandalizing imperative, quote, "What's falling ought to be pushed," end quote, serves ex post facto to codify an arch-bourgeois maxim. Probably all bourgeois revolutions were decided in advance by the historic upsurge of the respective class, an admixture of ostentation that was then externalized in art as classicist decor. Even so, at the point of historic fracture, that trait would have scarcely been realized without the acute absolutist mismanagement and the financial crisis on which the physiocratic reformers foundered under Louis XVI. The specific privations of the masses of Paris, at least, presumably set off the movement, while in other countries, where the need was not so acute, the bourgeois emancipation process succeeded without a revolution and left the more or less absolutist form of government initially untouched. One advantage of the infantile distinction of deeper cause and outward occasion is that it crudely registers the dualism of immediacy and mediation. The occasions were immediate, the so-called deeper causes are what mediates, what encompasses, what incorporates the details. As late as the most recent past, the preponderance of the trend could be read in the facts themselves. Specifically, military acts such as the bombing raids on German cities functioned as slum clearing, retroactively integrated with that urban transformation which has long been observable around the globe, not in North America alone, or the strengthening of the family and the emergency situations of refugee life did temporarily slow down the tendency to anti-family developments, but it hardly stopped the trend. In Germany, too, the number of divorces and that of incomplete families kept increasing. Even the Spanish conquest of old Mexico and Peru, which have been felt there like invasions from another planet, even those, irrationally for the Aztecs and Incas, rendered bloody assistance to the spread of bourgeois rational society, all the way to the conception of, quote, one world, end quote, that is teleologically inherent in that society's principle. The trend can never do without the facts, but ultimately such preponderance of it within the facts makes the old-fashioned line between cause and occasion look silly. The whole distinction, not just the occasion, is external because the concrete cause lies in the occasion. If courtly mismanagement was a lever of the uprisings in parts, even that mismanagement remained a function of the total picture of the absolutist, quote, outgo, end quote, economy's lag behind the capitalist income economy. moments which, as in the French Revolution, run counter to the historical entirety, while doing only so much more to promote it. Such moments derive their potency from the historical entirety alone. Even the lagging productive forces of one class lag only relatively, not absolutely, behind the advanced forces of the other class. One has to know all that to construe a philosophy of history, and it is for this reason as much as for any other that, visibly in the case of Hegel and Marx, already the philosophy of history comes as close to historiography as historiography itself. The insight into the essence veiled by the facticity it qualifies has come to be impossible save as philosophy. New section, Construction of the World Spirit. Dialectics is not a variant of Weltanschauung under this aspect either. It is not a philosophical position to be picked out from others on a sample chart. As the critique of the allegedly first philosophical concepts is a spur to dialectics, dialectics is a challenge from below. Experience alone, forcibly tailored to an obtuse concept of itself, excludes the emphatic concept as an independent, even though mediated moment. If it is possible to argue against Hegel that absolute idealism defies what is, and that it thus recoils into the very positivism it was attacking, as a philosophy of reflection, the dialectics due today would be the reverse, not just an indictment of the reigning consciousness, but the match of that consciousness. It would be a positivism which has been brought to itself, and which of course is thus negating itself. The philosophical call for immersion in detail, a demand not to be steered by any philosophy from above or by any intentions infiltrated into it, was Hegel's one side already. Only in his case, the execution caught in a tautology, as by prearrangement, his kind of immersion in detail brings forth that spirit which from the outset was posited as total and absolute. Opposing this tautology was Benjamin's intent, developed by the metaphysicist in the preface to Origins of German Tragedy, to save inductive reasoning. When Benjamin writes that the smallest cell of visualized reality outweighs the rest of the world, this line already attests to the self-consciousness of our present state of experience, and it does so with particular authenticity because it was shaped outside the domain of the so-called, quote, great philosophical issues, end quote, which a changed concept of dialectics calls upon us to distrust. The primacy of totality over phenomenality is to be grasped in phenomenality, which is ruled by what tradition takes the world spirit. It is not to be taken over as divine from this tradition which is Platonic in the broadest sense. The world spirit is, but it is not a spirit. It is the very negativity, rather, which Hegel shifted from the spirit's shoulders upon the shoulders of the ones who must obey it, the ones whose defeat doubles the verdict that the difference between them and objectivity is what is untrue and evil. The world spirit becomes independent vis-a-vis the individualized acts from which so-called spiritual evolutions too are synthesized, as is the real total movement of society, and it becomes independent vis-a-vis the living subjects of those acts. It is over men's heads and through their heads, and thus antagonistic from the outset. The reflexive concept, quote, world spirit, is disinterested in the living, although the whole whose primacy it expresses needs the living as much as they need it to exist. It was such a hypostasis that was meant in a stoutly nominalistic sense by the Marxist term, quote, mystified. Yet a dismantled mystification would not be pure ideology according to that theory either. It is equally a distorted sense of the real predominance of the whole. In thought, it appropriates the opaque and irresistible predominance of the universal, the perpetuated myth. Even philosophical hypostasis has its empirical content in the heteronomous conditions in which human conditions faded from sight. What is irrational in the concept of the world's spirit was borrowed from the irrationality of the world's course, and yet it remains a fetishistic spirit. To this day, history lacks any total subject, however construable. Its substrate is the functional connection of real individual subjects. Quote, history does nothing, does not, quote, possess vast wealth, and, quote, does not, quote, fight battles, end quote. It is man, rather, the real living man who does all that, who does possess and fight. It is not, quote, history that uses man as a means to pursue its ends, as if it were a person apart. History is nothing but the activity of man pursuing his ends, end quote. But history is equipped with those qualities because society's law of motion has for thousands of years been abstracting from its individual aspects, degrading them to mere executors, mere partners in social wealth and social thought. The debasement was as real as the fact that, on the other hand, there would be nothing without individuals and their spontaneities. Marx stressed this anti-nominalist aspect time and again, though without admitting its philosophical consistency. Quote, only insofar as he is capital personified does the capitalist have historic value and that historical right to exist, ... Only as a personification is the capitalist respectable. As such a personification, he shares the absolute enrichment drive with the hoarder of treasure. But what appears in the hoarder as an individual mania is in the capitalist an effect of the social mechanism, in which he is but a cog. Besides, the development of capitalist production necessitates a continuous increase of the capital invested in an industrial enterprise, and competition imposes on each individual capitalist the immanent laws of the capitalist mode of production as external coercive laws. It forces him to keep extended his capital in order to preserve it, and he can extend it only by means of progressive accumulation, end quote. Marx. New section, quote, harmonizing with the world spirit, end quote. In the concept of the world spirit, the principle of divine omnipotence was secularized into the principle that posits unity, and the world plan was secularized into the relentlessness of what happens. The world spirit is worshipped like the deity, a deity divested of its personality and of all its attributes of providence and grace. It is the execution of a bit of Enlightenment dialectics. The disenchanted and conserved spirit takes the form of a myth, or else it reverts to a shudder at something which is overpowering and at the same time devoid of qualities. Such is the essence of feeling to be touched by the world's spirit or to hear its murmur. It becomes a bondage to fate. Like the immanence of fate, the world's spirit drips with suffering and fallibility. As total immanence is blown up into essentiality, the negativity of the world's spirit becomes an accidental trifle. Yet to experience the world's spirit as a whole means to experience the world's spirit's negativity. This was the point of Schopenhauer's critique of the official optimism, a critique which remained as obsessive, however, as the Hegelian theodicy of, quote, this world, end quote, that mankind lives only in total concatenation, that it may have survived only thanks to that concatenation. This did not refute Schopenhauer's doubts whether to affirm the will to live, but upon that with which the world spirit harmonized, there did at times fall the reflection of a fortune far beyond individual misfortune. In the relation between individual mental gifts and the state of history, for instance. If the individual mind is not, as it would please the vulgar separation of individual and universal, quote, influenced, end quote, by the universal, if it is self-mediated by objectivity, the objectivity is not always bound to be hostile to the subjective. The constellation changes in the dynamics of history, in phases marked by a darkening of the world's spirit, of the totality. Even major talents cannot become what they are. inauspicious phases, as in the period during and directly after the French Revolution. Mediocrities were lifted high above themselves. If man is in harmony with the world's spirit precisely because he is ahead of his time, his very ruin as an individual is sometimes linked with a sense of not being in vain. Irresistible in the young Beethoven's music is the expression of the possibility that all might be well. However frail, the reconcilement with objectivity transcends the invariable. The instance in which a particular frees itself without in turn, by its own particularity, confining others, these instants are anticipations of the unconfined, and such solace radiates from the earlier bourgeoisie until its late period. New section, the unleashing of productive forces. Periods of harmony with the world spirit, of a happiness more substantial than the individual's, tend to be associated with the unleashing of productive forces, while the burden of the world spirit threatens to crush men as soon as their forces and the social forms they exist under come into flagrant conflict. Even this schema is too simple, however, and the talk of the rising bourgeoisie too shallow. Unfoldment and unleashing of productive forces are not antitheses in the sense of having to be assigned changing phases. Rather, they are truly dialectical. The unleashing of productive forces, an act of the spirit that controls nature, has an affinity to the violent domination of nature. Temporarily, that domination may recede, but the concept of productive forces is not thinkable without it, and even less is that of an unleashed productive force. The very word, quote, unleashed, end quote, has undertones of menace. There is a passage in Das Kapital, quote, as a fanatic of value utilization, the exchange value ruthlessly compels mankind to produce for production's sake, end quote, Marx. On the spot, this strikes the fetish which the barter society makes of the production process. Beyond that, however, it violates the presently universal taboo against doubting production as an end in itself. There are times when the technological productive forces, while scarcely impeded socially, work in fixed productive conditions without exerting much influence on these conditions. The unleashing of forces no sooner parts with the sustaining human relations than it comes to be as fetishized as the orders. Unleashing, too, is but an element of dialectics, not its magical formula. In such phase as the world spirit, the totality of the particular may pass into that which it buries. Unless all signs deceive us, this is the signature of the present epoch. In periods when the living need the progress of productive forces, on the other hand, or are at least not visibly imperiled by those forces, in such periods the feeling of concordance with the world's spirit will probably come to prevail, albeit with the apprehensive undercurrent that it is an armistice, and although the pressure of business will tempt the subjective spirit to defect overzealously to the objective one, like Hegel. In all of this, the subjective spirit also remains a historical category, a thing that has evolved, a changing, virtually transient thing. The still unindividuated tribal spirit of primitive societies, pressed by the civilized ones to reproduce itself in them, is planned and released by post-individual collectivism. The objective spirit is overpowering then as well as a barefaced swindle. New section, group spirit and domination. If philosophy were what it was proclaimed to be in Hegel's phenomenology, the science of the experience of consciousness, it could not, as Hegel does more and more, blithely dismiss the individual experience of the prevailing universal as an unreconciled evil and lend itself to the role of defending power from an allegedly higher vantage point. It is embarrassing to remember how inferiority prevails in committees, for instance, even if there is subjectively goodwill on the members' part, and this memory makes the preponderance of the universal evident as a disgrace not to be compensated for by citing the world spirit. The group's opinion dominates by way of adjustment to the majority of the group, or its most influential members. More often yet, it dominates due to opinions that reign outside the group, in a more encompassing group, notably in one approved by the committee members. In the participants, the objective spirit of the class goes far beyond their individual intelligence. Their voice echoes that spirit, even though they themselves, who may be defenders of freedom, feel nothing of it. Intrigue plays a part only at critical points as manifested criminality. The committee is a microcosm of the group of its members, and eventually of their totality. This shapes the decisions in advance. Such observations, which can be made everywhere, bear an ironic resemblance to those of formal sociology in Zimmel's style. But their substance does not lie in socialization pure and simple, in empty categories such as that of the group. Instead, which formal sociology dislikes reflecting upon, in line with its definition, they are impressions of a social content. Their invariance is a pure memento of how little the power of the universal has changed in history, how very much it always remains prehistoric. The formal group spirit is a reflective movement on material dominance. Formal sociology gets its right to exist from the formalization of social mechanisms, the equivalent of the dominance that progresses through the ratio. In agreement with this is the fact that the decisions of those committees, however substantial they may be in essence, are in most cases made from manifestly formal legal points of view. Compared with the class relationship, formalization is not more neutral. It is reproduced by abstraction, by the logical hierarchy of the stages of universality, and that the more bluntly, the more conditions of rule are made to disguise themselves as democratic procedures. New section, the legal sphere. And indeed it was in the philosophy of law that Hegel, following the book Phenomenology and the book Logic, carried the cult of the world's course to extremes. In large measure, the law is the medium in which evil wins out on account of its objectivity and acquires the appearance of good. Positively, it does protect the reproduction of life, but in its extant forms, its destructiveness shows undiminished, thanks to the destructive principle of violence. While a lawless society will succumb to pure license, as it did in the Third Reich, the law in society is a preservation of terror, always ready to resort to terror with the aid of quotable statutes. Hegel furnished the ideology of positive law because in a society that was already visibly antagonistic, the need for that ideology was most pressing. Law is the primal phenomenon of irrational rationality. In law, the formal principle of equivalence becomes the norm. Everyone is treated alike. An equality in which differences perish secretly serves to promote inequality. It becomes the myth that survives amidst an only seemingly demythologized mankind. For the sake of an unbroken systematic, the legal norms cut short what is not covered, every specific experience that has not been shaped in advance. And then they raise the instrumental rationality to the rank of second reality sui generis. The total legal realm is one of definitions. Its systematic forbids the admission of anything that eludes their closed circle, or anything quod non est in actus. These bounds, ideological in themselves, turn into real violence as they are sanctioned by law, as the socially controlling authority, in the administered world in particular. In the dictatorships, they become direct violence. Indirectly, violence has always lurked behind them. That the individual is so apt to find himself in the wrong when the antagonism of interest drives him into the legal sphere, this is not, as Hegel would persuade him, his own fault because he is too benighted to recognize his own interest in the objective legal norm and its guarantors. It is the fault of constituents of the legal sphere itself. Objectively true, however, remains the description which Hegel drafts as one of a supposedly subjective bias. Quote, that the right and morality and the real world of that which is right and moral comprehend themselves in thought, that by means of thought they give themselves the forms of rationality. To wit, universality and distinctness. This, the law, is what that feeling which reserves its own discretion, with that conscience which makes the right a matter of subjective conviction, will with good reason consider most hostile to itself. The form of the right as of a duty and a law strikes it as a dead, cold letter and a shackle, for it does not recognize itself in it, hence does not recognize itself as free. Because the law is reason in the matter, and reason does not permit a feeling to warn itself by its own particularity. End quote. Hegel. That the subjective conscience will, quote, with good reason, end quote, consider objective morality most hostile to itself. This word of Hegel's looks like a philosophical slip of the pen. He is blurting out what he denies in the same breath. In the individual conscience actually regarded, quote, the real world of that which is right and moral, end quote, as hostile because it does not recognize itself in it. No avowal would serve to gloss this over, for it is the point of Hegelian dialectics that conscience cannot act differently, that it cannot recognize itself in that real moral world. Hegel is thus conceding that the reconcilement whose demonstration makes out his philosophy did not take place. If the legal order were not objectively alien and extraneous to the subject, the antagonism that is inescapable for Hegel might be placated by better insight. But Hegel had far too thoroughly experienced its implacability to put his trust in that chance. Hence the paradoxon of his teaching, and at the same time disavowing the reconcilement of conscience and legal norm. New section, Law and Equity. Every positive, substantially elaborated doctrine of natural law leads to antinomies, and yet it is the idea of natural law which critically maintains the untruth of positive law. Today it is the reified consciousness that has been retranslated into reality, and there augments domination. Even in its pure form, previous to class content and class justice, that consciousness expresses domination, the gaping difference between individual interests and the whole that is their abstract aggregate. From the outset, by subsumption of everything individual under the category, the system of self-made concepts that serve a mature jurisprudence to cover up the living process of society is opting in favor of the order imitated by the system of classification. Aristotle's imperishable glory is to have proclaimed this against the abstract legal norm in his doctrine of, some word in Greek, of equity. The more consistently the legal systems are worked out, however, the greater their incapacity to absorb what essentially defies absorption. As a rule, the claim of equity, meant to be corrective for the injustice in law, can be knocked down by the rational legal system as favoritism, as inequitable privilege. The tendency to do so is universal, of one mind with the economic process that reduces individual interest to the common denominator of a totality, which remains negative because its constitutive abstraction removes it from those interests, for all its being composed of them at the same time. The universality that reproduces the preservation of life simultaneously imperils it in more and more menacing stages. The power of the self-realizing universal is not, as Hegel thought, identical with the nature of the individuals in themselves. It is always also contrary to that nature. The individuals are not only character masks, agents of value in a supposedly separate economic sphere. Even where they think they have escaped the primacy of economics, all the way into their psychology, the maison tolérée of uncomprehended individuality, they react under the compulsion of the universal. The more identical they are with it, the more unidentical with it are they as its helpless, obedient servants. Expressed in the individuals themselves is the fact that the whole, the individuals included, maintains itself only through antagonism. There are innumerable times when unavoidable motives of self-preservation force people, even conscious people capable of criticizing the whole, to do things and to make attitudes which blindly help maintain the universal even though their consciousness is opposed to it. It is only because to survive they have to make an alien cause their own that there arises that appearance of reconcilement, an appearance which Hegelian philosophy, incorruptible in its recognition of the predominance of the universal, corruptibly transfigures into an idea. What shines as though it were above antagonism is as one with the universal entanglement. The universal makes sure that the particular under its domination is not better than itself. That is the core of all the identity brought about to this day. New section. Individualistic veil. A candid look at the predominance of the universal does all but unbearable psychological harm to the narcissism of all individuals and to that of a democratically organized society. To see through selfhood as non-existent, as an illusion, would easily turn all men's objective despair into a subjective despair. It would rob them of the faith implanted in them by individualistic society, that they, the individuals, are the substance. For the functionally determined individual's interest to find any kind of satisfaction under existing forms, it must become primary in its own eyes. The individual must confuse that which to him is immediate with some word in Greek. Such subjective illusions are objectively caused. It is only through the principle of individual self-preservation, for all its narrow-mindedness, that the whole will function. It makes every individual look solely upon himself and impairs his insight into objectivity. Objectively, therefore, it works only so much more evil. The nominalistic consciousness reflects a whole that continues by virtue of obdurate particularity. Literally, it is ideology. Socially, it is necessary semblance. The general principle is that of isolation. To the isolated, isolation seems an indubitable certainty. They are bewitched, on pain of losing their existence, not to perceive how mediated their isolation is. Hence the widespread popularity of philosophical nominalism. Each individual existence is to take precedence over its concept, the spirit. The consciousness of individuals is to reside in individuals only, and not to be just as much the super-individual element synthesized in them, the element by which alone they are thinking. Stubbornly the monads balk at their real dependence as a species as well as at the collective aspect of all forms and contents of their consciousness, of the forms, although they are that universal which nominalism denies, and of the contents, though the individual has no experience, nor any so-called empirical material, that the universal has not pre-digested and supplied. New section. Dynamics of universal in particular. Compared with epistemological reflection on the universal and individual consciousness, that consciousness is right in its refusal to be consoled about evil, sin, and death by references to the universal. What recalls this in Hegel is a doctrine that seems paradoxical in view of that universal mediation, but is in fact magnificently paired with it. The doctrine of universal self-restored immediacy. But the nominalism that spread as a pre-scientific consciousness, and is today, from that standpoint, once again commanding science, the nominalism that makes a profession of its naivete, the positivistic toolkit does not fail to include pride in being naive, a pride echoed by the category of, quote, quote, everyday language, end quote. This nominalism does not bother with the historic coefficient in the relationship of universal in particular. A true preponderance of the particular would not be attainable except by changing the universal. Installing it as purely and simply extant is a complementary ideology. It hides how much of the particular has come to be a function of the universal, something which in its logical form it has always been. What nominalism clings to as its most assured possession is utopian, hence its hatred of utopian thinking, the thinking that conceives the difference from what exists. The bustle in the sciences would make believe that the objective spirit, established by extremely real ruling mechanisms, the spirit which meanwhile is planning contents of consciousness for its reserve army too, is merely the sum of that army's subjective reactions. Yet those reactions have long been no more than afterbirths of a universal which solicitously fets men so as better to hide behind them, so as to better to keep them in leash. It is the world spirit itself that has switched on the subjectivistically obdurate conception of science, the conception which aims at an autarkic, empirically rationalistic system of science instead of comprehending a society that is objective in itself and dictated from above. The rebellion against the thing in itself, once critically enlightening, has turned into sabotage of cognition. Although even the most crippled scientific concept formation shows surviving traces of the no less crippled thing. Kant's refusal in the Amphibole chapter to know the interior of things is the ultima ratio of the Baconian platform. The historic doctrine of its truth was the revolt against scholastic dogmatics. Yet the motif capsizes where that which it bars to cognition is cognition's epistemological and real premise, where the knowing subject must reflect on itself as a moment of the universal that is to be known, without being quite like that universal. It is absurd to prevent the subject's internal cognition of the very thing it dwells in, of the thing in which it has so far. It is absurd to prevent the subject's internal cognition of the very thing it dwells in, of the thing in which it has far too much of its own interior. In this respect, Hegelian idealism was more realistic than Kant. When scientific concept formation comes to conflict, as much within its ideal of facticity as with the ideal of plain reason, when it sets itself up as reason's anti-speculative executor, its machinery has become unreason. Autocratically, method takes the place of what it ought to make known. The positivistic cognition ideally of inwardly unanimous, non-contradictory, logically unimpeachable models is untenable due to the contradiction imminent in what is to become known, due to the antagonism of the object. They are the antagonisms of the universal in particular, in society, and the method denies them in advance of any content. Okay, so that is the end of the first video of Chapter 2 of Part 3 of Adorno's Negative Dialectics. Part 3 is titled Models. Chapter 2 is titled World Spirit and Natural History, an Excursion to Hegel. And this is, and this is video 1.